In conjunction with this morning's lesson, we will be reading from the book of Matthew. We'll be reading from chapter 6, verses 5 through 13. Matthew 6, verses 5 through 13. This passage is a lesson on how to pray. But when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. This is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. May God's blessing be added to this morning's reading.
All right, good morning. Nice to see everybody today. So we're going to be talking about prayer this morning, as you might have guessed from the reading. And so prayer is like a really short, simple topic. In fact, I think you guys could probably just start packing up. We'll be done in like 5 or 10 minutes tops. No. Oh man, I struggle to cut down content at the best of times when I'm trying to decide what to talk about. And this one was just like next level though for me. Honestly, I couldn't believe how huge of a topic prayer is in the scriptures. For instance, I found out that in the NIV version of the Bible, the word prayer or pray comes up like 360 times. It's amazing. Like, if you wanted to, you could literally read a different verse about prayer every single day of the year. It's just a crazy big topic. And so, since I'm sure nobody wants to sit through a 360-point sermon on prayer, we're going to have to cut it down in some way. And so I just want to be upfront in saying that this sermon is in no way going to do justice to such an incredible and deep and rich topic in the scriptures. But nonetheless, I hope and pray that our time together today will be beneficial for us as we try to be more like Jesus. The current discipleship sermon series that we're in is called Following Jesus. And we've been looking at some different things that Jesus did, and we've been asking ourselves, well, how can we do that too? And when it comes to prayer, Jesus again sets an amazing example for us. And so this morning, in order to try to kind of hone in our talk, I wanted to talk about how we can pray like Jesus. And to do that, I thought I'd break down the lesson into 3 parts. First, I want to look at what Jesus taught his disciples about prayer. What did he actually say was important about it? Second, I want to look at some of the examples in Jesus' life that we see in Scripture of when he actually prayed. And in doing that, we're going to have an opportunity to ask ourselves the big question, the question as disciples that we should always be asking ourselves. If Jesus did this, how can I do it too? And then finally, we'll look at applying Jesus' example to our lives so that we can start developing a stronger prayer life for ourselves. So let's begin by looking at what Jesus taught his disciples about prayer. Looking at the text in verses 5 and 6 here that Wayne read for us just a minute ago, we see that Jesus comes down pretty hard on the hypocrites for praying on the street corners, and he says that his disciples should instead go and pray in a private room. And so what does this mean? Did Jesus intend for us to take this literally? Should we only pray to God in private? Well, it would appear that he had something different in mind because we see him praying publicly in his ministry like all the time. But one of the most famous examples of that we probably have all read before is the time when he prayed before he fed the 5,000 plus people. And it shows up in Matthew 14:19, where it says, he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven. He gave thanks and broke the loaves, and then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. So here we see Jesus praying in a very public way, even getting everybody to kind of sit down and then look at him and pay attention to him while he prayed. And so he must have had something else in mind in the first scripture there when he was talking about not praying on the street corners, right? So let's keep that thought in our mind, and we're going to come back to it right away, but I just want to look at a couple other things that Jesus says here first. Again, in our reading today in verse 7, Jesus also says here that he doesn't like the pagan practice of praying with many words. So is Jesus saying that long prayers are no good? I mean, the model prayer that Wayne just read, he gives that like 2 verses after this. It's only like 4 sentences in English. So is that kind of like the gold standard for prayer length? If that's the case, then Jesus must have went way overboard here in Luke 6, where it says, one of those days he went out to a mountainside to pray and spent all night praying to God. So Jesus must have had some other idea in mind when he was talking about the many words of the pagan prayers. Just hold that thought in your mind along with the thought of whether we should pray publicly or privately. And we'll just hold those off to the side. We're going to come back to them in a minute. But I just want to look at one other thing here from verse 7, where Jesus says that he also doesn't like the pagan practice of babbling on and on. History tells us that many pagan prayers involved saying the same thing kind of over and over, and it seems like this is what Jesus is referring to here in this passage. So what should we conclude from this all? Is it wrong to pray for something more than once? Because Jesus taught something that seems, again, quite different here in Luke 18. It says, then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming him with a plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice so that she won't eventually come and attack me. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? So here at the beginning, we see that Jesus is actually encouraging his disciples to be persistent in asking God for what they need. And it's not like we're going to annoy God into answering our prayers like the unjust judge in the story. The teaching is that if even an unjust judge would listen to someone who is persistent, then how much more appropriate is it for us as God's children to pray to him about the things that we need? Okay, so let's try and put all of this together now. We're trying to figure out what Jesus taught about prayer, and we've talked about 3 different ideas here that Jesus is saying, where he seems to be saying sort of some conflicting things. On one hand, it sounds like he wants private prayer, but then we see him praying publicly. It also seems that he wants prayers to be short and sweet, but yet we see him praying long prayers, sometimes even all night. And it also looks like he's teaching against repetition in one case, but then in the other place, he's teaching a parable about the importance of being persistent in asking God for what we need. So how are we going to make sense of all this? And I know it's taken a while to go through all these examples, but I think it's very important for us to do this because we see an idea here that is foundational to many of Jesus' teachings about prayer. And I think there's one word that seems to bring clarity to all of this, and it highlights something that's critical for us to understand as Jesus' disciples. The word is sincerity. In the first issue regarding, public versus private prayer, it seems like it wasn't so much about who was around for the prayer, but it was more of an issue with the motivation behind the prayer. The problem was that the Pharisees were not sincerely wanting to talk to God. They were wanting to put on a show, which, for lack of a better term, Jesus thinks is junk. And this is what we need to take to heart. Jesus is teaching us that the prayers that we pray are always first and foremost about honest and sincere communication to God. But what about the other two up there? Is Jesus looking for long or short prayers? Well, again, it doesn't really seem like the length of prayer is what is in question at all, really, but it seems like it comes down to an issue of sincerity again. A few short sentences that are meaningful and sincere far outweigh paragraphs of insincere speech. But it's not like a long prayer is wrong either. In fact, it's amazing. But the reason it's amazing is because it's sincere. And so what about the idea of repeating requests and prayers to God? Is that okay or not? Well, again, it seems like Jesus is teaching more about the sincerity of the prayer. The pagans of Jesus' time recited prayers in a very mechanical way. They were obsessed with saying things just the right way and in just the right order to try and get the God they were praying to answer. And I think what we see Jesus saying here is it's not like that with the God of the Bible. He wants real communication with us. Verse 8 in our text that Wayne read says that God already knows what we need before we ask Him. And it's amazing to think about the fact that God doesn't need us to pray to Him to know what's going on, but yet He wants us to pray because He wants our time and He loves us. Isn't that an amazing thought? He wants to have honest and sincere communication with you. If you're talking to your spouse or maybe a good friend or a parent, can you imagine if the only way you communicated with them was by reciting like a ritual or a written out thing over and over? We understand that this is no way to have a relationship with the people around us, but yet sometimes I think we struggle to transfer that idea into our relationship with God. Jesus teaches us that prayer is first and foremost a real, sincere form of communication. And remembering this principle should really help to guide us through a lot of the questions that often come up in our lives about prayer. So we've laid a little bit of groundwork here about where our heart should be at when we come before God in prayer. The theory is really helpful for us to understand the concept of prayer and how important it is, but it's also really helpful, I think, to see it being demonstrated. And so we're going to go through some examples now from Jesus' life and look at his prayer life. And as we do, as I mentioned at the start, a good question to keep asking ourselves is this: does this example from Jesus' life show up in my life? And if not, how can I begin to start following his example more faithfully, and how can I learn to grow in those areas? So the first couple examples I want to look at from Jesus' life have to do with how he prioritized prayer. And so in Luke 5:16, we see this. It says that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. And again, something similar in Luke 9:18. Once when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, who do the crowds say I am? So here's a couple of cases where we get a glimpse into Jesus' prayer life. He spent so much time with people during his life, but these verses tell us that he also went away on his own just to be with God. Jesus was a busy person. He didn't start a revolution that has lasted for over 2,000 years by just being idle. But despite the pressure and the constant demands that were on him, he still made time to get away from everyone and be alone with his Father. But not only did he make the time to get away for prayer by himself, we also see this in Luke 9:18. It says, about 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. So Jesus also made time to pray with some of his closest disciples, Peter and John and James. And in this case, he took them up on a mountain so that they could pray together. And again, the idea here is for us to follow his example, right? So we need to be asking ourselves honestly, am I doing what he was doing? Not necessarily climbing a mountain, but the idea of making time to be alone in prayer with God and making time to be alone with other Christians so that we can just pray together. The next example I want to look at is from Luke again in chapter 6, verse 12, where it says, one of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. And we already looked at this example when we were trying to decide if Jesus was for short or long prayers. But notice now what it says here in the very next verse. In verse 13, it says, when morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, who he also designated apostles. I don't know if anyone's ever pulled an all-nighter in prayer. I've not done it, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't easy for Jesus. It would take a lot of strength to remain focused and awake for that length of time. But what I love about this example is that it shows how much Jesus valued prayer. He had a big decision to make, right? He was appointing the 12 apostles who would carry out his commands after he left this earth. And he valued taking that decision before God even more than sleep. And I think if Jesus was picking a t-shirt, we know which one he would pick. I think he'd be going for the prayer one every day. And he'd even pray. He'd even choose it all night too, I think. We see this desire to take things to God just really showing up in every area of his life. And another example I want to look at is from Luke 22, verses 41 to 44. This is the last example from Jesus' life we want to look at. It says that he withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. This is a window into one of the most challenging moments of Jesus' life. In a matter of hours, he was going to be crucified, and he knew it was coming. Can you imagine what that would feel like? This was a time of despair, a time of grief, a time that would press many of us into fear and anxiety and doubt and disbelief and many other things like that. Jesus' response, with all of this emotion flooding over him, was to get down on his knees and pray that God would take away what was about to happen. There were so many lessons that we can draw from this example, but I want to highlight how desperately Jesus clung to prayer during this time. Verse 44 is amazing because it says that the harder things got, the more Jesus prayed, the more earnestly Jesus prayed. It seems that as the pressure was ramping up, so were his efforts to pray, and it seems that the harder things got, the closer Jesus drew to God. And it says that Jesus found strength when God provided an angel for him. Again, I know I'm repeating myself, but the question we need to be asking ourselves is, as his disciples, am I following his example in my life? When hard times come to me, is prayer where I turn for strength? So we've talked about how one of the major themes that influenced many of Jesus' teachings on prayer was this idea of sincerity. And our prayers need to first and foremost be an honest and genuine effort to connect with God. And we see that theme showing up in all of the examples that we just looked at from Jesus' life as well. And those are the examples that we want to follow in our life. In a word, we see that Jesus made prayer a priority, and not only personal prayer, but also praying with other people. Next, I want to talk about 3 points of application that I think will help us to develop a stronger prayer life by following Jesus' example. The first is being intentional about prayer, and the second is using prayer to align our will with God's will. And finally, I want to talk about what we can do when God says no. So we'll talk about this a bit here now. To start it out, I want to look back at this example again here of when Jesus was praying all night before appointing the apostles. The story really blows me away, mainly, I think, because of how sacrificial this was. He made a real sacrifice so that he could speak with God before a big decision. He was willing to give up something important, sleep, because being in a situation, a situation before God that was on his heart was more important to him than sleep. And so, what about us? What happens when things in our lives get busy? Does talking to God fall off the priority list? Or do we carve out time, even if it means sacrificing other things? I know for me this can be a struggle, and maybe it is for you too. Maybe we can't imagine spending a whole night without sleep so that we can pray, but what about like 10 minutes? We could get started with that. Could we skip a few minutes of sleep? Or maybe we could skip a meal or an episode of Netflix to make time to talk to our God. Though I do struggle, the success I have had at making time for prayer usually boils down to one phrase: being intentional. In my life, I've been very intentional about praying in the morning and making that a part of my routine. When I wake up, I try very hard to spend just a couple of minutes praying to God before anything else. Before my feet hit the floor beside my bed, I try to take a few minutes to talk to God and ask Him to have His presence with me through the day to strengthen me. These prayers are not long, but neither was the Lord's Prayer. Alicia and I have also made a routine to pray together in the morning and then again before bed and before meals. It takes a bit for routines to catch on, but then it becomes second nature. And now I highly value these times with God. I realize that everybody's going to have a different schedule and different obligations, and so that these exact ideas and suggestions might not work in your life, but the point I'm trying to make is that we all do need to take a look at our lives and find out where we can make time for prayer. One thing is for sure, this will not happen on its own. We have to be intentional about it. It's so easy just to say, oh, I hope I can get better at prayer one day. But we all know that until we take that initiative and become intentional about it, nothing is really going to change. Having other people around us to help us stay accountable is also a big help. Jesus intentionally carved out time to be with his disciples to pray. And as we saw in the example where he took Peter and John and James up on the mountain, in the same way we can share our prayer life with others. And that can be a great motivator to other people, and it can in turn motivate us at the same time to pray. The idea of this really shows up really well, I think, in Luke 11:1, where it says that one day Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples." So not only did Jesus carve out time to pray with his disciples, but the disciples often just saw him praying off to the side, which set a really good example for them. And it made them come to him and ask, teach us. We want to pray like that too. And it's amazing because right after this verse, Jesus, in Luke's account, goes on to teach them the Lord's Prayer, or the model prayer. And this made me think of a really amazing example that some of the women in our congregation have set, and I wanted to share it with you. Almost 2 months ago, I think it was almost 2 months ago, Indra and Flora Beth came up to me and Alicia and asked for some help with setting up a virtual prayer group. They wanted to be able to meet together with other women and pray about stuff that was going on in their lives. And we thought that was a great idea. So we helped them set up a WhatsApp prayer group. And now they have a video chat every Friday afternoon. I think it's in the afternoon. And they discuss things that are going on in their lives. They talk about the verse of the day for their day, and then they just pray together. And I just thought that was such a cool example. WhatsApp is an app, if you don't know what it is. It allows for video chats of up to 8 people right on your phone or your tablet. And once you have a group set up on there, all you have to do is push one button, and then you're immediately talking to whoever is in that group with you, and you can pray and chat and do whatever. And it's so easy to set up. It's a brilliant technology. And so I think it's a great way for us as Christians to get connected with other people and have an opportunity to pray even during the middle of a pandemic. And I just wanted to offer this morning too, if anybody thinks this is something that they could get going in their life, you want a hand setting it up, just come and find me. I can help walk you through it. It's really easy. And so the next thing I wanted to talk about as we try to apply this teaching to our lives is how we can work at aligning our will with God's will. In verse 10 of our text, which is up here, during the model prayer or the Lord's Prayer, Jesus taught his disciples to pray for God's kingdom to come and for his will to be done. Instead of praying these exact words in an impersonal way, just saying them like, your kingdom come, your will be done, where we aren't really involved in any way, I think a better way to pray for his kingdom to come is to pray for his kingdom to come, starting with the request that we are currently praying for. In order to make that change, we have to first realize where each of us are at with our prayer life. A good question to ask yourself is this: is your prayer life better described as self-focused or kingdom-focused? Do you see prayer as primarily a way to get what you want from God? Or do you see it as a way to seek God's help in building his kingdom? Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that we shouldn't ask for the things that we need from God. But what I'm saying is that we should consider how those things that we're asking for can contribute to God's kingdom and pray for them in that way. The difference may seem subtle, but I think it can be very powerful. In the first case, God becomes the one serving our requests. But in the second, God is still helping us, yes, but we've trained our minds to see that the reason that he is helping us is so that we can serve him better. Do you see the difference? If we can make this shift in our thinking, I think it can literally change the way we pray about everything. It's the difference between praying for healing so that we can get back to our normal life and praying for healing so that we can have the capacity to serve more fully in God's kingdom. It's the difference between praying for a new job so that we can be more comfortable and praying for a new job so that we can be more generous and that we can have more influence over the other people in our lives. It's the difference between thanking God for a meal and thanking God for giving you the energy that you need so that you can serve him more effectively. I think when we start praying like this, the end result of what we're praying about or what we're requesting will still be the same thing, but the way that we will see it and think about it will be totally different, because we're going to start thinking about his kingdom as the focus instead of ourselves as the focus. And when we see him answering those prayers, we'll be empowered because we'll remember that the things he has given us for a reason. So we're talking about praying with a kingdom focus there. And the final thing I wanted to talk about is what we can do when God says no or wait. The answer we all love to hear, right? I'm sure we've all gone through this, and I know that there are many listening this morning who are going through it right now. How do we react in a healthy way when this is going on? We've already talked about how it's okay for us to be persistent in prayer, keep asking for God for what you need. But how do we stay patient while we're waiting on God's timing? Or how do we learn to accept the no answer when we really just want it to be a yes? Let me be clear that I do not have all the answers to this. But I want us to consider how we can make two shifts in our perspective that might help us to see things just a little bit differently. If we're only praying for things based on our perspective of the situation, then we're only going to pray for the things that we want and the things that we think are best. And that's not all wrong. But the problem is that we lack so much perspective for most of the situations in our lives, and we sell ourselves short when we forget to include God's perspective in our prayers. Considering his perspective is the difference between praying, Lord, this is what I need, please do it for me, and praying, Lord, this is what I see, but I trust that you see a fuller picture, and so this is what I would like you to do, but ultimately I pray for your will to be done. I want us to look at a couple pictures here to try and help illustrate what I'm saying. The first is a view from a vehicle, and this view here represents our life. We can see in front of us, beside us, maybe behind us. And based on what we can see, we have this kind of snapshot of what would be best for us in the next few seconds. The second is another view here on the screen. And I want you to imagine for a moment that your car is right there, a little dot in the center. From the first viewpoint, you can only see things in your immediate context. But the second viewpoint here is supposed to represent what God sees, the bigger picture. He can see that there's a traffic jam up ahead, or he can see that the road you're on is going to be a dead end when you can't. He can also see that the path you're on now might be bumpy, but if you keep heading in the same direction and persevere, things will only get better. This illustration isn't perfect, but I do find it helpful to help understand why God sometimes answers a prayer in a way that we just can't understand. Why did the woman who Jesus healed have to suffer from bleeding for like 12 years? I'm sure there was a lot of days when she cried out to God and asked him to take it away. Or why did Hannah have to be barren for so many years, even though she continually cried out to God for a child? Why did that man who Jesus healed in John 9 have to be blind since birth? Why did the Apostle Paul have to suffer in prison for so many years? Or why did Joseph have to get sold by his brothers into slavery? Why did Jesus have to die such a cruel death, even when he was praying that God would take it away? Why do we have to go through the situations we're going through, asking God for direction, asking God for resolution, and not seeing the answers that we want to see in the time that we want to see them? As you might expect, I don't have an easy answer. But we can find freedom and peace when we put our trust in God. Don't worry, He's got a good track record. We see all the stories, in all the stories I just mentioned from the Scriptures, God had a plan for good in all of those situations, and we can trust in God that He has a good thing planned for us in our lives today as well. There is freedom that comes in saying, I trust that your will is better than mine, and I trust that you know what's best in this situation, so please let your will be done. So that's the first shift. We might not understand why God is saying no or why He's saying wait, but it can help us to gain confidence and trust in Him when we remember that He sees infinitely more than we do. There are many reasons that God may choose to say no when we ask for something, and we can't always expect to understand those reasons. But the Bible points out one possible reason for a no answer here from Paul's life when he gave the answer no to him for one of his prayers. It says this in 2 Corinthians 12, 8 and 9. Paul is speaking here. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but He said, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. What I want to talk about here is shifting our perspective away from the problem itself and instead focusing on how God might be using our struggle to shape us and mold us for a special purpose in His kingdom. Paul was going through a tough time, and he pleaded with God multiple times to take the problem away, but God's answer was no. God's answer to Paul was, my grace is sufficient for you. Have you ever thought about what that means? Have you thought about how that exact same thing might be true in the struggle that you're facing as well today? We don't know what Paul was praying for. But whatever it was, instead of just taking the problem away, God said that He was going to be with Paul and help him endure through it instead. Why would God do that? Why wouldn't He just take it away? I think the answer is that God had plans to use Paul for a special purpose, and somehow the problem that he was going through was going to allow for that to happen. And I want us to consider the possibility that maybe God is working in the struggles in your life in a similar way today. Thinking back on the past issues you've faced in your life, Where did you decide to turn to for support? Maybe you've had to deal with the loss of a loved one, or a poor health diagnosis, or an addiction, or depression, or an injury, or a sin problem, or a marriage problem. Isn't the person who you want to talk to in those situations the one who has gone through it themselves? Don't we seek out advice from the people in our lives who have endured these things and by God's grace have continued to endure them and even made it out the other side? My point is this: God can use the situation you're going through to help you serve in a powerful way that other people just can't. Instead of taking away the problem, it's possible that God is choosing to help you endure through the problem so that you can be better equipped and better experienced with wisdom that is far beyond that of the average person. Instead of only focusing on the problem, an important question for us to ask ourselves might be, how can I use the situation that I'm in to serve in a way that most people can't? When we shift our focus like this, it can help us to see beyond the problem we're facing. And it can help us to see how God is using our lives to contribute to something so much bigger and so much greater than just ourselves. So we've really only just scratched the surface on this amazing topic of prayer this morning. But I hope that we've covered some things that will help us become better disciples of Jesus. One of the main things that Jesus taught about prayer is that it needs to be genuine and sincere. And not only did he teach about these things, but the amazing thing that we see in Scripture is that he also showed us examples of what it looks like to model prayer as a priority. And as we try to model Jesus' prayer life for ourselves, we need to remember that we also need to make an intentional that we need to make prayer an intentional priority in our lives as well, by carving out time in our schedules to pray by ourselves and also with other Christians. We also talked about praying with the underlying motivation of trying to align our will with God's will and praying for things that result in the growth of His kingdom. And finally, we talked about a couple ways that we can respond in a healthy way when God says no by changing our perspective. We're going to end off with a song that Richard's chosen for us to get us focusing about these things. And I hope and pray that as we sing this together, that the words will encourage you to think about this example that Jesus has set for all of us. If you want to talk to anybody more about any of these things, as always, please feel free to reach out to me. Thanks for your time this morning.
Let's stand as we sing the invitation hymn. Take my life and let it be consecrated